Hi, it's Jesse Alton, aka Mr. Metaverse, and this is the Metaverse Interop Show. I've got a great episode for you today. I had the privilege of interviewing Tom Ffiske, who is an advisor at Accenture, also runs ImmersiveWire.com, which is one of my favorite Metaverse publications and news sources. And overall, Tom was just such a pleasure to have on the show and to chat with, and I hope that you'll enjoy this. Stay tuned. It's the Metaverse Interop Show. How was that? To be able to see you. So, Tom, welcome to the show. I'd love it if you could, I guess, introduce yourself. Like, who are you and why do you like the Metaverse?
Certainly. It's great to be here as well. So, the crux of where I've come from is I do come from immersive tech as a whole. So, the first time I tried virtual reality was way back in 2015 or 16, where it was the first person Pac Man maze. So, you are in like a maze, you use a little whiz dish. I don't know if you remember them, but whiz dish is when you run around in place and you're in the maze, you're trying to run away from ghosts, basically.
Okay.
And then after that, I was like, you know what? I think immersive tech has got something here. I think this is very cool. So I started a precursor website called Virtual Perceptions, which focused more on immersive technologies. 2020 is when the offshoot of that was the Immersive Wire, and now I focus solely on the Immersive Wire, and my focus on immersive technologies has morphed into these metaverse discussions. Now, that does mean that my view of the metaverse is slightly different from many other people. There's a lot of people who say it's more Web3 based or blockchain based. I don't disagree with that. I do think there are elements of it that could interact with it. But in my heart of hearts, I've always been a spatial guy, and I've always been a big fan of immersive technologies as a whole.
Yeah. I love that background. I remember being I can't lie. I remember being triggered by Google Cardboard getting released because
Really?
I started trying to create the metaverse, I guess, about 10 years ago. And my novel approach was that everyone has a phone in their pocket. So I thought VR is going to have a comeback because of the smartphone. And Google Cardboard was so early. I mean, in our current iteration of metaverse work and XR work, that like I was like, oh gosh, these big companies are already caught on. Like I don't stand a chance. And I remember being really concerned about it. And then when it fizzled out, I was sad, but I also felt a bit of relief. So I'm like, okay, we still have time. But I
It still
come
did
back
the damage,
to
though. Like it still did the reputational damage in the
yeah,
sense that people see virtual reality in one particular way. That's no fault of Google in the
yep,
slightest. I do think there was such promise in having a cheaper form of accessing immersive content. The unintended repercussions is they did shape the view of what VR is for a lot of people, which
yeah.
does shape the discourse.
Yeah, I think it'll come like full circle too. I think as these bigger companies, as other large companies like Apple do dip their toe in and get involved, I think the phone will become ever more obvious again. And we're going to
Mm.
see, I mean, AR is already shining a great big spotlight on the capabilities of like mobile performance, but and then obviously with the pass through on headsets now, it's like you're just seeing it all kind of meld together. So I guess I wanted to know, like, as more companies, my thing is Interop, right? So like as more companies enter the metaverse and start to say, okay, we want to participate, right? Like interoperability is obviously going to become increasingly important. I'm curious how you see that being addressed at a macro scale.
I do feel that organizations such as the Metaverse Standards Forum will help with that. And I do feel that that kind of positioning of having that square is really important for that exploration. I
Mhm.
do feel there needs to be a hands-on element as well, which is why I was excited to see the Linux Foundation launch their own version, which they
Mhm.
are, if as far as I understand, they are working with the Metaverse Standards Forum, but also being more hands-on in how that's actually going to look. What are these kind of open source file formats we're using? What are we going to be agreeing upon? How are we going to evolve from there? That
Mhm.
hands-on element is really important, and I'm hoping that the conversation on interoperability becomes more nuanced over time. You run a podcast on this. I think you've had enough people to tell you that, oh, good golly gosh, wouldn't it be amazing if we're interoperable, right? That's not the
Yeah.
problem. The
Right.
conversation 2023 is how we're going to go hands on, how we're going to do it, and
Mhm.
how we're going to have that consensus. And those are bigger questions, which I hope will resolve this year.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to like a recurring theme for me, which is like I see it as there's two big blockers to interoperability and therefore two big blockers to the metaverse. And that is IP and ego, right? Like
Yes.
IP is what slows down the behemoths like Google and Apple from being able to just be like, okay, you know what? We're interoperable. You can take this Halo helmet anywhere in the metaverse. They have swaths of lawyers that have worked really hard to moat off their IP. And so just undoing that is going to be a challenge. But ego, we can do something about. We can't solve it, but we can do something about it. And I feel like, yeah, sure, we see OMF, we see other emergent standards bodies starting to emerge. And as a founder of OMI, I have an option. It's, do I get triggered by their creation because here's another bifurcation in the effort? Or do I embrace the uniqueness of their group? They felt a need to start it. And so how can we work together? And so I have to constantly question, like, do I care more about interoperability existing or for getting credit for starting the group, right? And I think that's something that is probably the biggest blocker is the platforms out there or the engineers who know how to build the metaverse. I think it's ego that gets in the way more often than not. Is that why would I use your standard? Why would I code it that way? I think we've just become conditioned. Apple versus PC, PlayStation versus Xbox. Like you carve your line, you make your decision, and then that's it. And then you want to continue to reinforce that decision and why you're right. And I think groups like MSF, OMI, the emergent OMF, I think that they pose a challenge to that. They shake up ego because now you can bring your thoughts, you can get credit, but you can also hedge your bets on implementation by working with other people. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do think it will shake up that ego aspect as well. And what I'm liking is, I think it depends how you frame it as well. I do think having multiple groups does shake that ego, but it does clutter the field a little bit more because it's less clear or the right direction would be. So there's a part of me that thinks that perhaps a more virtuous line of inquiry would be to focus on the ease of developer use. So
Yeah.
when Pico announced, for example, they're using the OpenXR standard when it comes to headsets, that's a good example where within the press release and notes, it highlights the fact it's just easier for developers to create applications throughout this standard and be able to deploy from there. And I do feel that if you create a standard which is easier to use and easier to implement, that is probably a better path for adoption of sorts, which removes that EU side as well. Because my God, you could just implement it from there. So I think Pico had the good idea there when it comes to that very niche but very apt area.
Yeah, I have to agree. Like I get excited whenever I see any company, regardless of size, whether or not they use blockchain or not. Like I don't care. I get excited when I see them advocating for and obviously contributing towards these open standards. Any like I the so here's a funny thing. Like let's talk about NFTs real quick. Like
Please,
blockchain, I know blockchain is part of the metaverse, right? I think it's not the metaverse. And there's those in the camp that think that, when I say metaverse, they're just thinking blockchain. They're thinking Web3, blockchain solely, not Web3, the future of the web, right? And so it's always interesting. Like I will say, if you want to know the worst NFT picks, follow me for 2023 because I'm just horrible at picking them if I want to make money on them. But what I've started doing is I got back to what originally made me dip a toe into NFTs in the first place, and that's just supporting these indies. I like indies. I like the underdog. I like someone who's out there pushing really hard. And so I've been collecting assets from people like Misfit Pixels, who are creating interoperable VRM avatars. Actually, I'm keeping my eye on another one that's going to be coming from Emotional. I'll put a link in the chat. But you're starting to see indie service providers be able to create entire businesses solely using open standards. And Ready Player Me did the same thing, but at scale, right? Their whole product is mostly using an open format of GLTF. It's super simple. I can come in, scan my face, get this asset, and then go use it places with or without an RP1 integration. And so when I see companies or indies championing these standards from the get-go, I want to give them my money. I want to share their stuff because I feel like they're being the change, and so I must agree with you. Pico, just saying the words OpenXR is putting these open standards at the forefront so that other investors and builders know that they exist. I think a lot of them don't know that these options are out there.
I think so too. And it's not just a question of options. I mean, it depends who you talk to. I think there's a lot of business leaders who are happy to take the top level elements. Fact of the matter is, we both agree it comes down to developers actually, building it. So it's quite good to have these announcements to highlight that and to explore how these can be implemented. But going back to your NFT points, I'm relatively careful about NFT stuff as well. I've seen plenty of great examples where influencers use this opportunity to exploit their audiences, and I really think there are better approaches when using those technologies. And I have seen some compelling use cases of blockchain as a whole, more enterprise side as well. What I'm trying to work out in my head is scale. So I've not come across yet a blockchain which can handle an economy of people or like a country of people. And that's really significant because there's just not enough capacity or power to have something like that and be able to have the seamless transactions similar to what MasterCard would be able to provide, for example. Once we have a technology which is as efficient as that, then I think we will have that frictionless experience which will lead towards adoption. But I've not seen that yet. And we've seen, if we don't have it, we've seen what happened when we don't. Like, look at other side who did their land sale and it spiked up gas fees on Ethereum to provide an example. And I know that they addressed elements of that. I know other blockchains is potentially better than that in some way, but try and match that with what a PayPal fee of what 50p. The comparison is just not there yet.
Yeah. I've lost a lot of money on gas and on experimenting, just learning. Right when I first started dipping my toe into Ethereum specifically, I did not know what I was doing. I was too proud to go out and tell people I didn't know what I was doing because I've been in tech for so long and I've been following blockchain for so long, but I didn't know. And so I would keep retrying transactions and not realize that I'm burning $70, $80 in gas at a time. And next thing I know, my wallet's empty. And I'm like, oh goodness. Like, again, too proud to go tell people that my wallet's empty. I would just refill it and try to keep experimenting. And I feel like a lot of people have been in that camp. And there's only a small number of people who really do benefit from those mistakes. The people who own OpenSea, the people who own these transactions, like if your NFT gets stolen by OpenSea, bless them for doing this. They refund you your 2.5% that they get, right? But that's it. So you're still out 97.5% of the money that you spent. And so I think that there's a lot of those growing pains. I'm curious, do you think the free market is going to produce this blockchain that's capable of sustaining a country worth of people, or do you think it's going to be the government or governments that create these capacities of scale for their people?
I softly suspect government, and the reason why is because we have a lot of blockchains. They're reliant on nodes and people who are using these nodes across a global network. Now, you could, in theory, create an incentive for users to become a node to then be part of the system. I know that's how other blockchains have grown. But if we need the scale for which to handle an economy, that becomes potentially government intervention territory, because I can see plenty of private companies who feel that they either lack the investment required to do so or lack the support in order to do so as well. Now, that can mean that the government would be supporting, might work with multiple tech vendors in order to do this, for example. But the crux of it is that there needs to be at least some level of government intervention or coordination, because I don't think this incentive is strong enough for there to be enough nodes for there to be a functioning economy.
Right. Yeah, I suspect that you're right. And I think that, I mean, at least the US government is famous for taking their time to try to strike when the iron is hot, right? Like, you see, that's when they issue fines, is when they hit the max of their, what is it called? When you have, goodness, I'll come back to it later. But
I mean, when you severely mess up or something like that, I don't know.
Yeah, they try to wait until the right time to strike, right? Like until they have enough. I don't know if they have enough precedence is the word exactly, but statute of limitations. That's it. The government is famous. The U.S. government is famous for extending their statute of limitations. You can see it, for example, in the cannabis industry. The federal government has not cracked down on any of these state governments who have legalized it, but it's still federally illegal. And so what you're likely to see in the next couple of years is the federal government crack down on all of the statewide institutions that are, distributing cannabis. And it'll be a one-time fine, and then boom, it's done, right? So they really do want as many of these statewide institutions breaking the law as possible. I suspect there's something similar in the blockchain world. I feel like they're dragging their toes, waiting to see what the best way is to tax, fine, repent, and then we're going to move forward with the government as a participant in this ecosystem. So I guess the metaverse, though, itself more broader, right? If you had to spend an entire day, right? Let's say the metaverse is interoperable. It is what we want it to be. If you had to spend an entire day in the metaverse, what would you do?
My God, I actually haven't thought about that. Wow. I guess he would be socialized, I guess. Here's the crux of it, right? If you ask someone in the 1900s what the 2000s is going to look like, they can use the framework of the 1900s to talk about what the 2000s will be. They'll see more steam-powered stuff. They'll see more wooden machines. They'll be flying in the sky, and they're like cars and stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like I am a guy in 2023 trying to speculate on what things I'll do in 2033. Like, podcasting didn't exist a few decades ago. YouTubing didn't exist a few decades ago. TikToking didn't exist a few decades ago. I used to do all three, although on the latter, on TikTok, I am terrible. Do not look at it.
It's hilarious.
So, like, I just think what I'm going to be actually doing in the metaverse will probably be something I can't even think about right now. It'll be completely unique. I'm sorry for the cop-out answer, but every time there's been a new technology like this, there's genuinely a new type of economy or a new type of content or a new type of community. And that's what I'm excited to see.
Yeah, I have to agree. And, with the metaverse being like the virtual universe, it's as close to magic as we'll get, right? Being able to summon from this digital realm into our physical. And obviously, when you're in the digital realm, being able to just summon digital things on demand, that's awesome. And it gets me excited. But it's going to challenge so many things. We're going to see exaptations occur here in the physical world because of UI and UX patterns that are occurring in the virtual. I guess a teleport, right? Teleports make total sense in the metaverse, but we don't have teleports here. But I imagine through the act of teleporting throughout the metaverse, it's going to change the way that we transport ourselves here in the physical world. So are you
the seamless aspect, of course?
Yeah. Are you seeing any? I'm curious. Have you seen anything bleed over or anything? Does anything come to mind for you now that's in your day-to-day life here in the physical world that maybe has changed as a result of the virtual?
Well, it's influenced on a very personal level. I now work at Accenture as a thought leadership strategist. So my specialism in the area has had a great impact in the role which I have. So, but that's a very personal one. On actual activities and what I do on a day-to-day, I had a background in gaming as a whole, so I do like the new types of video games coming out on it. I appreciate that's not metaversey per se, but you got to bear in mind this will be the introduction to many people if they're more virtual reality. So it's a key one to explore a little bit to some extent. I think one of the coolest ones I've come across were tour guides. So there's one person I've come across. I should remember their name, but they're a tour guide for Horizon World. So what they do is you pay them, and they'll take you from world to world to world to show you kind of what's out there in Horizon and to try out new things within Horizon Worlds. And the idea of a metaversal tourist guy is quite endearing, quite a sweet idea, I feel. And I like the idea of someone just exploring around there. But now my brain is racist. I wonder if there's like a dark tourism equivalent when there might be more like Metaverse worlds and there might be tour guides.
Right.
It might be quite entertaining in its own way.
I'm sure, like maybe at least in VR chat. I remember that. Oh, goodness, I'll have to remember their name later. But the documentaries that were coming out on YouTube by that young filmmaker that was talking about VR chat. It'll come to me a little bit later, but they did an outstanding job on their documentaries.
Yeah, I remember that, and it was like one of the highest rated HBO shows, if I remember. Like it did really well. Yeah,
fascinating. Yeah, like and I was like, it was so good, and I'm pretty sure that individual was like in high school or like just out of high school. So pretty amazing work. I'll try to find the link and include it below for later. So I have a series of like thought-provoking questions here, and point of order, I did use AI to help come up with these because I'm not this interesting, but I'm grateful for AI being able to help augment these questions. So the first is, as the metaverse grows in popularity, concerns about privacy and data, right? We're seeing them become more and more pronounced, if you will. So how do you think the metaverse industry can handle some of these issues, or what should they be paying attention to right now?
I believe we're doing some pretty good stuff already. So there's the XR Safety Group, which is doing some great work, for example, led by Kavya Perlman and Marco. And they're doing some
XRSI,
amazing,
yeah.
and they're doing some incredible work. And
Mhm.
I think, and they're already being looped into conversations to at least evangelize or point in the right direction of what we should be doing. I know that we speak to Meta, for example. They are speaking to other organizations. I
Mhm.
know they're doing work with other councils. Groups like that, advocacy groups, are really important because they do also connect to developers who work in the day-to-day and stuff.
Mhm.
And the crux of it is, I do worry to some extent that you have companies who want to move fast and do things quickly, and it goes down to like a developer who wants to, they want to ship a product, and they
Yeah.
don't think about, well, the unintended consequence of doing this in this way, doing that in that way, and that's the worry which I have, because I don't think we're going to have issues due to someone wanting to do this or wanting to do that. It will be unintended. There'll be an
Mhm.
unintended consequence of doing this in this particular way. And I've read plenty of sci-fi and read plenty of academic papers to know that a lot of technological issues come down to just lack of awareness rather than actual malicious action. So
Yeah.
it's something which
I
I'm being cognizant of.
I appreciate that you're highlighting the keyword unintended, right? Like that's kind of my gripe. If anyone's read my reading, my gripe with the concept of just build bro is really, just build bro is like the antithesis of the extreme that I'm on. So I acknowledge that I'm on an extreme of like, let's take our time, let's work together, let's chat about these things and make sure that we're coming up with something that's balanced. I get that everything can't be perfect, and sometimes you have to move fast to break things. But this concept of just build bro poses one massive threat for the metaverse, and obviously for blockchain technology as well, particularly DAOs, right? We're talking about the way that organizations are governing themselves, sometimes how money is handled. These things are profound. And if we're not mindful of the systems that we're developing, you can create new, severe, and immutable systems of inequity for the future, right? So those unintended consequences are the reason why I have a gripe with just build bro. But as a product person, I get it. Build, iterate, reflect, and I think that iterate, reflect is the piece that is the safeguard against some of those unintended consequences. But frankly, I don't think very many of these groups are iterating or reflecting. I think they're just building in a panicked race to try to be the first, quote unquote, the first metaverse, blah. And so I do appreciate you highlighting that.
And I do think that, I mean, you can marry best of both worlds. You can build while being self-aware. As part of your
Right.
product pipeline, you can have like a pause. I'm not going to say it's going to be a day, obviously not a day, but you can have like, as part of the sprint, you'd be like, all right, stop.
Yep.
Here's what we've done so far. We're like, let's have a think. This is what we've done. What are our goals? And what else could this be used with? And just have
Yeah.
that little like breather to have a consideration of that. But I agree with you also on what you've just said as well. Like, that's critical.
Yeah. With the clients that I consult with, I'm not a scrum master. Anybody who practices agile scrum, like I'm not a scrum master. I'm also not a product owner. In agile, you have these agile roles, and being a product manager, which is my trade, is not even an agile role, where I'm not somebody's boss. My job is to come in and be influential enough to persuade each other to consider each other, right? Get the investors to consider what the developer is saying is actually feasible and what users actually want. Get users to give us feedback on what they actually like that was feasible in the first place. That's gonna, and is it gonna generate money for us? Just this constant thing. I'm always this person who's a bug in the ear, right? And it can be challenging. Retrospective, I with a lot of the companies that I consult for, I wound up filling in these agile roles just because they generally don't have a scrum master. They generally don't have a PO. They're usually just grabbing tickets, if any ticket at all, and just coding. But I think if anybody were to adopt, my point is this: if anybody were to adopt anything from agile or scrum, the retrospective that you and I are talking about is the only ceremony that you cannot skip, right? If you could literally fly by the seat of your pants, but if you meet every 2 weeks to say what's working and what's not working and what you're going to try differently, you can do anything. So I love that our conversation is taking this direction.
I know it's irrelevant, right? Like when it comes to interoperability, those pause moments are so important, right? You can't just keep going, and you could, like a little offshoot of a plan, just skew in an opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to focus, and I think that focus does come down to good product managers and also a good cohesive vision from the team as well.
Absolutely. And these repeatable processes, right? These little tiny good habits can take you really far. I think one of the pushbacks I'll get from like an engineer who's experienced but not necessarily experienced with product or agile is they're like, we don't have time, we don't have money, I can't be coming to a bunch of meetings. Like these are the repeat things that you hear over and over again, and their concerns are totally valid. Unfortunately, it takes time for them to buy into the process. And again, retrospective is like what makes it so much more relevant, where you just realize that you're not just flying around. I'd say one of the biggest criticisms of the metaverse, and also real quick time check, do you have an additional like 18 minutes or do you have to run? So I can account for that?
You have me for an additional 13 minutes.
Deal. All right, cool. So one of the biggest criticisms of the metaverse is that it could further exacerbate the digital divide, right? So we're talking about inequity. We talked about XRSI. Essentially, it could exclude the folks who can't afford a fancy headset or a really nice gaming computer. How do you think the metaverse industry can address this or is addressing this?
I think it is critical because it's proven to be a price elastic market. So in taking the UK as an example, but it's an example that's repeatable across the board, the cheaper an immersive tech device is, such as virtual reality, the more likely is they'll just get sales, regardless of the quality itself of the VR hardware. So you could postulate about like the frame rate, you could postulate on like views, you can postulate on just how good the tracking is. Fact of the matter is the everyday consumer, they're more interested in how much it costs, and then they'll buy the one which is more cost competitive, particularly around Christmas time.
Right.
That is the element which is super critical and just something to consider. And that's why I worry when companies are trying to make an accessible VR headset or accessible AR headset, but see these barriers of just making sure it's as competitive as possible. But it's critical to do so. A natural thing that will solve itself over time as production processes get better and better, components get cheaper and cheaper. But the trajectory is going to take time.
I think that's where I have to give a shout out to the Oculus browser team, and I consistently give them a shout out as their work with WebXR. They've implemented WebXR early. They've been massive contributors towards just its evolution and actual usage. You're seeing people be able to post new apps and new games that they otherwise wouldn't have had the chance. And so I've always been kind of drawn to XR, to WebXR and that open standard, kind of bringing it back to mobile. Let's shift here to, in the spirit of some of our final questions here, like in the metaverse, users will be able to create and own their own digital assets that ultimately have real world value. So we're talking about like a new economy here. Do you think that the metaverse overall needs to be hyper aware of preventing fraud? Do we need to be focused on preventing fraud, which I think is something this on-chain thing solves? Or are there other aspects that we should be more focused on for this future economy?
So yeah, I think fraud is really important, and well, to avoid fraud, let's be clear on that. And so when I was speaking to lawyers last year in a crypto disputes conference, the underlying understanding I have is that there is not enough protection for the consumer when they do transactions like this, similar to other areas of life. So if you do a normal payment via bank or such like, there's some level of protection. Like you're protected to an extent. You don't quite get that with blockchain technologies, and it's actually quite hard to track where those items can go. And however much people talk about how a blockchain is secure or how a blockchain is like safe, people are dumb. And I'm being very flippant about this, but
yeah,
you can't socially engineer people just to do it. That's the problem. Like you have the most secure systems in the world, and to say that the system itself is secure, that's not the problem. The problem is fraud happens anyway due to social engineering and just people not knowing what they're doing, which does happen.
Yep.
So the crux of it is, I do think, well, going back to this blockchain example, we're going to interoperability. And I do think there needs to be some veneer or layer of authentication on the user so that assets can at least be tracked to whoever it went to or where they went. I appreciate that it flies away from the center of what interoperability is, and no, not interoperability, sorry, decentralization is, and being unable to see who someone is. I just think it's important because if you want to have a trustworthy system of transactions and movements, you're going to have like a framework that actually works, And I think we're lacking that at the moment. And we've seen all the number of fraud cases last year and the year before, and presumably this year as well. We're not there yet. And I just think that it'll be interesting to see organizations like what the European Commission will be saying in May in relation to it, for example, and see where it goes from there.
All right, I have one more professional question and then one fun question, and then I think we can wrap it up. So my next question here is, as we look ahead just to the next 3 years, let's give us a scope, a classic roadmap scope of 3 years. Which markets do you see having the most potential for growth and success within the metaverse? And how can these companies position themselves to capitalize on the opportunities?
Cool. Let's go one by one. Fitness is a key one. It's clearly a revenue generator within immersive tech space. I predict that will continue to grow healthily, and you may see more and more devices that are focused on it. Valkyrie is a great example of creating these little muscle things where you simulate how you do things, and that's really cool tech, for example. What other areas will go really well? I do think there'll be exclusive clubs. I appreciate we're using the knowledge of today and expanding to the future, but I do think we're going to see a lot of private clubs, which will be accessible only to people who hold a certain item. And I do think that's going to grow over time. I'm not saying this is like huge scale per se, but those clubs in of themselves will be able to run quite smoothly and do very well. Soho House style, basically. I could see that working very well. And I guess one more area which I was thinking of, which I think could work quite well, is mindfulness. I do think there's an element of escapism that does come from these virtual spaces. Now, there's plenty of debates that comes around when it comes to the malicious aspects of isolating someone or being private or perhaps having a virtual world in a particular way. But that customization also blends into, why not create a peaceful world or provide services to help relieve people's anxiety or depression? And I think we're going to see a spurt of devices which, a la Headspace, will expand further into immersive technologies. And I think that'll be a growing area over time as the technology gets cheaper and better.
I love that. And those are 3 markets that you're kind of seeing have traction right now too. So folks who are watching this, it's not like this is off the deep end. There's reference points that they could go and look at.
Yeah. The first 2 have been provable to work. The latter one, I'm seeing smaller companies doing smaller things in it, but I think has great growth potential because there's a market there. And I think it comes down to a startup that's able to be cost effective and also to deliver value.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then my last question for you, and then if you have any questions for me, you can ask before we wrap this up. Again, I appreciate your time today, Tom. If you could design your own virtual world, or physical world, you get to be God today. If you could build a world, what would it look like, and what rules would you impose?
Oh no, is this going to go public? No. So here's what the world is going to be. It's going to be comfortable. Like, fact of the matter is, when I do go into my personal spaces, I like to have some level of comfort because ultimately there's an element of just detaching. So it will be quite a comfortable world of sorts, potentially pastel of sorts, quite soft coloring. There will be social elements to this, where I like the idea of a little table. I'm going through a Dungeons and Dragons phase at the moment, so
awesome.
What I would do with this table is there'll be customizable elements where I just make it more immersive when we're doing these D&D games, and that, I think that'll work really well, for example. And controversial, but I would not have a television screen of sorts because, I do much prefer being in person and seeing friends around the TV. I understand if you're remote or there are people long distance and you do something like that, that's a nice in between. But I quite like, I don't know, I like the idea of just having a whole screen just to myself and just
Yeah.
on my phone. So I would not
Yeah.
have that. And that's how I've designed my own personal little bubble world.
What's your what's your D&D class? Is a bonus question. Or are you the
When it comes to my
DM?
creativity, it's not the class that's the thing. For me, it's just the characters I do. I did 3 goblins in a trench coat, trying to secretly get by at one point, for example. That was entertaining. I was another bird creature who was in like a little hub world. If you're familiar with the world from Lady of Pain, then that area. And
Okay.
this works out with tourism. So there's little birds who basically helps with tourism just around the multiple worlds. This gets ganged up by all these other people as well. I have a creative side which I like to express in those kinds of places. Another element of creative comes down to my own writing within Immersive Wire too. I appreciate a non-fiction style, but there's an element of me after work where I like to have some sort of creative outlet. For some people, it's knitting. For other people, it's cooking. For me, it happens to be focused on immersive tech stuff. But what do you do? And I assume for you, podcasting. So we all have outputs.
I'm with you. There are a few things that I want to talk about aside from the metaverse, and I have to break that news to new strangers every time we sit next to each other. I'd be like, listen, if you ask the question what I do, it's going to be all we talk about for the next 2 hours. So otherwise, let's not chat, neighbor. Well, I appreciate you being a good neighbor today, Tom. Any parting questions or thoughts, comments for me?
Good question. I assume you've asked every guest about the virtual world question, or was I the first person one you've asked on that?
You're the first, and you're also the first official interview in this format on this show. So the other interviews have been different, a little bit different. But yeah, you'll be the first, and I will ask that question again.
Interesting. Then allow me to the first to positive back to you then, because I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the virtual world element too.
If I could build my own dream world, what would it be? What would it look like, and what rules would we have?
Exactly.
Okay. Wow. So for me, I love puzzles and adventure. So my world, if I could build a world, would be ever shifting, ever evolving. Obviously, this is complicated, but I like the idea of some type of AI assist creating a planet or a level or a temple that you have to get to, and there's people or things trying to stop us from getting to the end of it. Those could be dynamically generated. So in my perfect world, it is using all open standards. You could bring your own avatar. You could have your own wearables, and I could put on my armor. And what my goal is to get through this puzzle hopefully with friends. And at the end of the puzzle, there's loot or collectibles that may be dynamically generated by AI, but even more preferable are contributed by indies who are using the open inventory. I like the idea of a world that is a puzzle that was generated just for us. And when we get to the end of it, there's assets just for us. And those assets were created by indie sword designers, indie clothing designers who contributed to this open pool, right? This open inventory. And that's kind of a vision that's been motivating me all along with interoperability. Is the concept of interoperable inventory is super dependent on us using similar protocols and being able to actually get assets from one world to the next. But once we crack that nut, it becomes a place where folks can literally say, I'm a spaceship designer. I make the best robes in the metaverse. And whether they want to put them up for sale or just contribute them to the general zeitgeist of the metaverse, they can. And so that's what I see. And that's what motivates me is this endless adventure that is generated through user and AI content.
I think I really like that element because of the changeability aspect. Problem with this question, like, is if you have your own personal space, but like your home, you're going to change it up all the time anyway. Your flavors will change, your tastes will change. And I like the idea that this is not a location which will not move. It will just keep on shifting as well. There's an element of me that thinks that, you know how like sometimes in real life you've got these dilapidated towns which kind of rust away or turn to dust over time and be emptied. Problem with the metaverse is you can have a perfectly preserved failure for like a long time if you mess up. You'll have areas of the world which will be like empty, barren, never worked, but they
Yeah.
are in condition. And I
Yeah.
wonder what the repercussion of that would be.
What entropy may look like in the metaverse, right? I mean, there's a whole entire new sub economy that opens up from entropy. You have to get your swords resharpened. You have to get your armor repolished. You have to have your house fixed or maintained, or else you lose that plot. I think a lot of companies want to see that.
You have an
Yeah,
element of that with like virtual items. You have items which can only be used a set number of times. So
true,
that's built with smart contracts. So
true.
people do integrate entropy anyway. But for
Yeah.
the love of God, I don't want that with a home. I don't want my home to disappear after 5 tries. Let's avoid.
Right. Well, I know that we're actually at time here. I'm so grateful that you come on the show. I love all your writing. Where can people get in touch or follow you at?
Certainly. So you can find me on www.immersivewire.com. It's a newsletter where I summarize what's happening in the metaverse each week with a flair for fun as well. I'm also on LinkedIn, where I post a bit too much than I should, and on Twitter, where I should be posting much more than I could be doing. So you can find me in both locations. And his name's Tom Ffiske, and it's lovely chat with you today as well.
Cheers, Tom. It's the Metaverse Interop show. How was that?